The apartheid system ended through a series of negotiations between 1990 and 1993 here in South Africa. Those negotiations resulted in the country's first non-racial elections in 1994, ushering in the birth of a rainbow nation. But 28 years into our democracy, we are yet to fulfill the vision of a non-racial and unified country. Good evening and welcome to Unfiltered. My name is Aldrin St-Pierre. Tonight we're asking you, do some Afrikaner youth reject a non-racial South Africa? Remember that you can be part of our conversations using our Twitter handle @Unfiltered SABC. That is @Unfiltered SABC. On Facebook, just search for Unfiltered SABC and join the conversation. Let's welcome via Zoom Professor Christy van der Westhuizen, visiting professor at Leipzig University in Germany, Masilo Silokazi, who's the SRC chairperson at the Stellenbosch University. And in studio, we are joined by Francois van der Merwe, director of Bittereinders, Nobel Peace Prize winner, though, the late Archbishop Desmond Tutu coined the term the Rainbow Nation.
We used to say, we will be free, all of us, black and white together. Now, we are going to say, as we wave our hands, we are the rainbow people of God.
Well, there is Archbishop Emeritus Desmond Tutu joining us now in studio. Francois, let me start off with you. Who are the Bittereinders?
Aldrin, firstly, thank you for letting me on your show. It is very rarely that you see someone of my political views that is allowed on the mainstream, and I want to appreciate your bravery for talking to me as well. The Bittereinders is an Afrikaner youth movement. Well, our focus is on the youth to restore the identity, the sense of nationalism and pride among the Afrikaner youths, and to we also do teenproteste. Sorry, I can't know the English.
Okay.
We do anti-protest against members of organizations like the EFF, ANC, SANCO, when they target schools, old age homes, and of course small businesses. So we mobilize communities and we direct them and coordinate them into these mass protest actions.
With what intention? What is it that you're trying to achieve?
So firstly, it is usually there's usually a racial connotation. When we step in, we are approached by either school members, parents, or some of the managers at the certain institutions like a small business or an old age home, and then they say the EFF is coming, there's been a dispute or an incident at the school, and then the EFF or the ANC or SANCO wants to exploit the racial incident and make it political, and then we just basically go to neutralize the threat, the terror threat from these organizations, and we do that on the ground. We do not we sometimes have approached the courts, but it is always on the ground where we physically resist, stop them from damaging the premises or intimidating the certain manager so that he must negotiate with them.
Why do you term it terror?
Because it is terror, because they want to terrorize the schools, the businesses, the old age homes into submitting to their demands. And we basically come in and say to them, do not come outside, do not negotiate with them in fear. You are on equal playing field. We will make sure that there's no threats here from them, that there's no damage to property, because many times the police have showed us that they do not have the will to protect premises, and we will not take that chance that they fail in their objective when it comes to institutions like schools or old age homes, which is a vital part for us.
Okay, just quickly, the final one is on nationalism. How far would you take this nationalism? Is just nationalism amongst Afrikaners, or is it nationalism with the intention of bringing back what we experienced during apartheid?
So it is not a strong ethno-nationalism. It is more like we have to live in reality. We do not have such a close tie with Europe anymore, but we have to be, we are an isolated group here in Africa. We are politically isolated, we are geographically isolated, and we are also being isolated by the many institutions of this country, by race-based laws, laws, by BEE, by the quota system. And we have said that the only way we're going to stand up is by grouping together under a national identity and lifting ourselves up above the oppression and the oppressive laws of the current ANC government.
Let's quickly bring into the conversation Masilo, Silokazi, who is this SRC chairperson at Stellenbosch University. Masilo, just listening into what Francois has to say here, are these views that you have come across at the university?
No, I haven't come across students that sort of identify with the Bittereinders. I have had conversations with people that do feel like their identity is disenfranchised in the space, but it's definitely something that the university works on in terms of being more inclusive. But in terms of the context that's just been described, no, I haven't encountered that in the ASU space.
Then what would you say is behind some of the racial incidents that have been reported on at Stellenbosch University?
So I definitely think it's a very nuanced sort of situation in that we all can recognize that there's a pattern. When a student gets intoxicated, it seems that students of color tend to be the targets of either violence or just acts of dehumanization in the space. So there's definitely a pattern. Where that pattern sort of comes in also is a very difficult one. It's either because there's an internalized racism, it could be circumstantial. So there's definitely a lot of studying, also studies that we need to do in the SU space to sort of just analyze specifically where that is coming from.
Yeah. Okay, Professor van der Merwe, thank you so much for Professor, well, we're getting my stuff now mixed up. Professor van der Westhuizen, rather. Good evening, and thank you so much for making time for us. What do you make of what Francois has just articulated now? And there's also that sense of feeling that you are, or you can't locate yourself within the South African general identity.
Well, good evening. It's good to be with you, Aldrin, and with your guests and audience out there. I think what Francois is describing is something that we've heard from the white right wing in South Africa increasingly, and I think it's part of a phenomenon that we are seeing across the world, in fact, with greater polarization in society. So not only in South Africa, but actually across the world, where you see greater polarization based on political positions and particularly racial polarization in a society like ours. So what we're seeing, and we can also see it in our electoral patterns over the past number of years, the Freedom Front growing its representation at the ballot box, and as well as the EFF. So you see this kind of pulling by groupings that are particularly using race to mobilize people and to try and gain support for themselves. So it seems to me to be a pattern that we're seeing actually across the world, unfortunately, the abuse of race to try and gain rather some social traction among groups who are feeling excluded for various reasons. The feelings of exclusion frequently come out of economic exclusion, actually. So we know that South Africans generally are under massive economic pressure, but by and large, Black South Africans are actually suffering a lot of economic pressure. So, but we are seeing a tiny sliver of the white population also experiencing some feelings of economic exclusion, and these kinds of people can then be available for mobilization on racial grounds.
Mm-hmm. And just quickly, Francois speaks about the BEE policies, and you've just now mentioned the issue around exclusion. However, the BEE policy is there to try and correct a wrong fundamentally, but however, though, it does also mean a level of discrimination.
Well, I think what we're particularly talking about here are employment equity policies, and then also our Black economic empowerment policies. And they are historically directed in the sense of correcting what was created under colonialism and apartheid, because as we know, those systems were massively exclusionary, and because of racism, institutionalized racism, and those systems were based on the dispossession of black people. So, in the democratic era, we have instituted these policies to try and redress those injustices of the past, and the effect is, of course, then that certain younger generations of white people, particularly people who were, that tiny sliver of the white population that was historically more marginalized, can actually feel some of the brunt of these policies, and they then become available for this kind of mobilization.
Okay. And when we come back, we have a conversation about whether or not the Bittereinders also are against the development of South Africa. How do they perceive the development of South Africa, being that also that you have the majority in this country being black? And welcome back to Unfiltered, as we deal with the question looking into the young Afrikaners and also asking the question whether they are resisting a non-racial society here in South Africa. Francois, what would your answer be to that question? Is your organization anti-transformation?
Thank you for the question. Firstly, I will start with the idea of a non-racial South Africa. South Africa is probably one of the least non-racial countries in the world, where there is over 90 race-based laws, where there is institutional racism, of anti-whiteism or even anti-Afrikaner policies like BEE, where there is the quota system, where there is race inscribed into every facet of our society, from the handbooks of our children and their math equations, to the economy on a BE level, in the politics, in the legal system, in the courts, where it is acceptable for someone like Malema to say, kill the farmer, kill the boer, where it is acceptable for him to assault a white police officer, where it is acceptable for him to say, we are not calling for the slaughter of white people, at least for now. So South Africa is really not a non-racial society. There is some institutions or some parties that want to make it a non-racial society, but the ANC and EFF, which is a large majority in this country, is actively making this country more aware of race, which is making it more multiracial. And so in that sense, we are a reactive group. I would not be sitting here today if this nation was non-racial. But the fact that it is non-racial, the fact that Afrikaner schools are being targeted disproportionately to make it English, instead of boarding schools for black people in their own home tongue, they are assaulting.
Are you anti-transformation?
No, I am for Afrikaner belang, for Afrikaner. I can't get on the word in English now, sorry. But I am for Afrikaner belang. Of course, there must be more black schools built, so that they can teach, so that they can learn in their own home tongue. Just like Afrikaans children must be able to learn in their home tongue. This thing that all schools must now fall into English or must be taught in English is actually, I think, part of in a sense, colonialist. Because why are we forcing the Zulu or the Xhosa child to get educated in English when we know there's a big disadvantage? And in that sense, the transformation can go forth as long as it wants, but not at the expense of my people. The transformation can go on, but we believe that if South Africa, the new South Africa, continues on the path it is now, my culture will die out. It is the number one enemy in this country. We are the number one scapegoat. There is no way the Afrikaner culture will survive the new South Africa. And I actually want to ask Kirsty a question later. Is in this non-racial society, is there a place for a white Afrikaner nationalist man like myself?
Okay, Professor Christie, do you want to answer that?
Well, we've got a constitutional democracy, and what it means to be in a constitutional democracy is that it's actually a country that is based on human rights and on inclusion of people. And but part of creating this inclusive society, that because we don't have an inclusive society yet, we don't have an equal society yet. part of doing that means that we have to have corrective action with regards to past injustices. So, and if you look at the statistics, apart from that sliver of the white population that I spoke about earlier, that are, one would say, that actually fall among the poor, the vast majority of white people are middle-class people. The vast majority of white people are economically relatively well off. And wealth, by and large, still sits in the hands of white people. So I think that those are the facts, and we need to redistribute wealth in this country. We have half of our population living under the breadline, and those people are, by and large, black people. So that's an injustice that must be rectified. Definitely not through violence. Definitely not through an attack on white people or the exclusion of violent exclusion of white people, or anything like that. But we have to find ways, and that's why I have these policies, to try and rectify these injustices from the past.
Okay. Masilo, just quickly then, the conversations that happen at Stellenbosch University, which also include conversations around inclusivity, how do you approach that conversation from an SRC level? Because inclusivity also means having enough money to actually access that university.
So in terms of inclusivity, it ranges into different sort of topics. So when we do speak about race, it is very much in terms of intersectionality. We're sort of touching on, at least what Christy spoke about, sort of like that sliver of the white population that was sort of disenfranchised even as early as apartheid. So sort of having that type of discussion about how disenfranchisement or even not feeling included in the space or not having financial access can also reach different bodies of people. But on top of that, also recognizing that a large majority of South Africa, or at least a large majority of Black South African students, also do not have access to pay for university. A lot of them are dependent on NSFAS. A lot of them are still experiencing living in spaces that were historically for Black South Africans. So having those nuanced, open discussions with students and trying to make that as open as possible, as opposed to sort of having them into small pockets or having groups speak separately on an experience that only affects them, but really honing in on this issue of integrating everybody and making sure that all those points of views are made aware of so that there's more understanding.
Yeah, so there's the one part of inclusivity, but then there's the next level, and that next level then speaks about the environment at a university space, for instance, that also recognizes the lived realities of a Black child, also considering, of course, that this is a university that is rooted within the apartheid system as well, but then the transformation agenda as well being quite important, but creating that environment that says that we could recognize the lived reality in the majority of young Black people.
So in student community spaces, it's sort of compulsory for all student community spaces to have these types of conversations. We call them res ed sessions. So essentially we go through sort of set topics that the residences and student communities, so by student communities I'm referring to community students or PSO students. These are students that live off of campus but are SU students. But they sort of have to have these types of conversations. So they're usually focused around social justice, so they'll be about race, they'll be about financial access, they'll be about the LGBTQ community, they'll be about financial access. So these conversations, they have to be had, especially for newcomers when they come into the space, but also it's set for student leadership in the spaces to be having these conversations as a part of getting their accreditation for being leaders. So the conversations happen every year, they're compulsory. There's no way of sort of getting around them.
Yeah, but are they yielding the results though? Again, speaking about some of these racial incidents that are coming out of Stellenbosch, including the peeing on people's properties.
So some spaces, I can say, are more transformed than other spaces. The sort of the con is that it's very difficult to monitor the transformation in like a set space. So there's definitely spaces, like I said, that are more transformed than others, and there are other spaces that need a lot more work.
Okay, when we come back, we'll have the conversation about what should happen now, and also we'll look at some of the tweets that you've sent through and being part of this conversation at Unfiltered SABC. That is our Twitter handle, and remember that on Facebook you can search for Unfiltered SABC as well to be part of this conversation. We'll read some of your comments when we come back. And welcome back. Before we get closing remarks from our panelists this evening, let's just quickly look at some of the tweets that you've sent through. This one from Vuyogazi Cham, who says, there's no such thing as non-racialism in this world. South African politics are based on a racial war over the country's resources. Racism will only be defeated the day all black people vote for pro-black parties. We need to use our numbers to our advantage. And this one from Supernova Afrikaner, youths reject a non-racial South Africa because it means they have to work as hard as black youth to get jobs and or management positions. Their fathers who not so long ago were in the apartheid army teach them by words or actions that other races are less superior. Masilo, just quickly some closing remarks from your end. How do we reach that stage of inclusivity? And I guess there's a big debate around what non-racialism really means, when a person could argue and say that if you don't see my race, then it means that you don't see me at all.
I sort of think maybe it sort of can come down to two things. I think the first is that there sort of needs to be, we need to move away from sort of denying that certain incidences or certain cases just across South Africa do have to do with race. So the attempt to sort of move away from talking about the issue of race, I don't think is going to be the most effective thing. Unfortunately, people's identities are intersectional, and that means that their identity is either tied to their race, it's tied to politics, it's tied to their sexuality. So an attempt to separate them is not effective. So we just need to recognize that those sort of aspects of a person are intersectional, and also stop shying away from sort of having having those discussions. And then sort of the second thing in terms of inclusion
unfortunately, Masilo, we've run out of time there. I just need to give Francois quickly your closing remarks.
So I'm going to quickly add on to Masilo. Yes, culture and identity is bound to culture. I believe, like he said, that we believe other races are inferior is the idea of the past.
So you're not racist?
I do not care about the other races, the color. I care about my own nation. I care about the Afrikaner. I don't care about the Englishman.
So you don't care about the black South African?
No. My main focus is the Afrikaner. And I want all cultures in this country to be treated equally, to have their day under the sun, and to govern themselves, to have the chance to enact their own ideas into policy and their own religion.
And then quickly, Professor Christie, closing remarks from your end?
Yes, thanks, Aldrin. From my side, just to quickly say that I think it's important for us not to be distracted by the sometimes spectacular politics of the white right. So, because one can get into, there's always been a white right fringe in South Africa, also during apartheid. I mean, the National Party government was obviously very reactionary, but there were white people who were even more reactionary in the form of the nasionale Partij and the AWB and the Conservative Party and so forth. So we must actually, for me, it's important for us to actually look at existing practices of exclusion, institutional cultures at universities that are toxic to black people, that are not inclusive. We have to look at certain masculinities.
Unfortunately, Prof, we've run out of time.
And so forth.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. Thank you so much for choosing Unfiltered with me, Aldrin Simpier, on S3. We're back again next week, Monday, same place, same time, right here on S3. Tot ziens. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and thank you so much to my panelists for joining us this evening.